A reading from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verse 1 to 12. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, the headland of Pisgah, which faces Jericho, and God showed him all the land. Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the stretch of the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, and as far as Zoar. Then God said to Moses, "This is the land I swore to Sarah and Abraham, to Rebekah and Isaac, to Leah, Rachel, and Jacob, that I would give to their descendants. I have let you feast your eyes upon it, but you will not cross over." So there in the land of Moab, Moses, the servant of God, died as God decreed, and he was buried in the valley opposite Beth Peor in the land of Moab. But to this day, no one knows the exact burial place. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyesight was strong, and he was still quite vigorous. For 30 days the Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab, until they had completed the period of grief and mourning. Now Joshua the Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites gave him their obedience, carrying out the order God had given to Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face. There is no equal to all the signs and wonders God caused Moses to perform in the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all Pharaoh's officials and the whole land. How mighty the hand and how terrifying the displays of power that Moses wielded in the sight of all Israel. For the witness of ancient Israel, thanks be to God.
Hear words of wisdom from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 to 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. For the love of God in Christ Jesus, thanks be to God.
Greetings in the name of the Lord, and what a joy it is to be here with you today. I've walked past this church many, many times, so what an honour to actually be standing here today. And thank you, Josephine, for inviting me to bring a reflection, and for everyone for their warm welcome. I've invited my husband, Reverend David Russell, who just this year is celebrating his 40th year of ordination as a Uniting Church minister. He's my number one fan, my greatest ally, and during this service he's going to do some readings from where he's sitting. Thank you, David.
Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And I said, Here am I, send me.
Well, today I've brought my very battered Presbyterian hymn book with me to remind me of my faith beginnings as a small child in Presbyterian Sunday school. But in 1990, I lost all of my belongings in a flood. But the next day, this hymn book turned up in a pile of mud wedged up against my letterbox. Now, if that wasn't some sort of profound sign, but in the back, still in pencil near the torn page, with all these numbers, it says, Susan Burrow, 3825, back in the days when we only had 4 numbers in our telephone. Ring if there is no one else. So, ring to play the piano if there is no one else. I've always had that feeling of not being good enough. I'm 16 in this photo, in 1970. I recently read Wendy Harmer's memoirs entitled Lies the Mirror Told Me. I identified with this, not through facial deformity as with Wendy, but through others and myself who told me, you are not pretty enough. You are fat. You are not good enough. You don't really play the piano very well. Not the real pianist. Not the real mother. Not the real Baptist minister's wife. That's not my current husband. And not the real pastor, myself. That people always had expectations of me that are so high and I cannot meet them. But through many traumatic but faith-filled life experiences, I have come to know that God's hold on my life is not second best. And it is stronger than my own reservations, though living with anxiety and many self-incriminating imperfections. Recently at a retreat, I shared a reflection on being real, and the velvet rabbit got a little look in, if you know the beautiful story of the velvet rabbit. I shared my commitment to be my real self, to show up, to do my best, and believe that I am good enough for all that God calls me to be and to do. For me, in answering the whom shall I send call, it has to be part of being real and realising the value of the original, warts and all. Not a forgery, not a copy. I want to be true to who God forged me to be. In my ministry of pastor role in Uniting, through my formation of the charity Hats for Homeless, as a member of Mustard Seed Uniting Church, and in my role as Deputy Chair of the Pastoral Relations Committee of Sydney Presbytery. I want to show up to do my best, and mostly, I want to create a place where we care for each other. We pray for each other, encourage each other, but hold each other accountable and tell the truth. We are then able to approach our work with God's blessing in a place of confidence to provide the love, care and compassion we know people are longing for. This is my 50th year of working full time. So you've all done the maths, you know that next year I'm having a big birthday. But I'm not allowed to talk about it yet until my daughter has her birthday next week, and then we can talk about it. So firstly, I began as a teacher. I actually began 6 months late at Teachers College because I didn't have the right number of marks to get in. And then they didn't have enough, so they sort of let me go in. And the principal said to me, "You're like a horse starting a race with no chance of finishing." And off I went, and I became a teacher of the deaf, a literacy teacher, a TAFE college manager, an executive director of a private hospital, and now as chaplaincy convener for Uniting in Sydney Central Mission. In my spare time, I'm an official visitor for the Minister of Corrections in Corrective Services, ensuring the rights and care of Aboriginal inmates is managed and all inmates are heard. If there's no one else, then why not let it be me? I'll do my best. Okay. I'd like to share Martha's story with you. I brought Martha with me today. She's in a beautiful frame. Please have a look at her at some stage. I'd like to share her story because it's entwined in my story. When my paternal grandmother died in 1976, my cousin and I found a sealed letter inside the family Bible to be opened on her death. The letter told the story of her own mother, Martha Louisa Burton, who had died in 1941. With a secret, she had been told that she was not the biological daughter of her mother, Louisa, but of her father's mistress, an Aboriginal woman who lived on a camp on the river of my great-grandfather's property in Dunkeld, near Bathurst. This is Wiradjuri country, and Martha was taken by George Burton for safekeeping when government officials rounded up what was then called half-caste children from their families. Martha's birth mother had died. Her name I do not know. She had been cared for by elders. George's family, somewhat embarrassed, I would suggest, sent quickly to Scotland for a young bride, Louisa McIntyre, who arrived in Australia aged 18 to marry George and to raise Martha, then aged 3, as her own child, and go on to have 11 children to George. Martha belongs to the stolen generation, as she was raised white, with no knowledge until her own mother Louisa told her on her deathbed. Martha's birth certificate was forged, showing George and Louisa as her parents and making her 3 years younger than she really was. Martha knew nothing of her heritage, her language, her stories, her kinship. My grandmother, my father and myself were denied our Aboriginal heritage because of the shame each generation felt of the truth of Martha's birth. In each of my areas of work, I have worked with Aboriginal children, adults, and especially inmates in corrections. They all call me aunt. They ask me, "Who is your mob? Where are you from?" They accept me as part of their mob without any DNA testing or Lands Council certification. But while I treasure this acceptance, I am left with a feeling of unease and unbelonging. So Martha there on the left This is me, and it's not with a didgeridoo, it's with the handle of my father's rake in the backyard. But I love that photo because it's the photo where I feel I look like a little Aboriginal girl. Then, a few months ago, I went out to Bathurst for a friend's funeral, and I always take beanies with me. My car is always full of beanies. And I found these brothers and a sister in the park, gave them all a beanie. We had a lovely conversation in the park where I played as a child in Bathurst. And then just a few months ago on NAIDOC Day, for the first time, I told Martha's story at MLC when I was invited to be the guest speaker for NAIDOC Day. It was a scary day to tell Martha's story because I want to know, am I allowed to tell Martha's story? Is it okay to tell Martha's story? It is Martha's, it is mine. And now I share it for those who want to listen. To learn the impact of the practice of children being removed and raised white. To learn the impact it has on their descendants. But I know to whom I belong. Accepted, beloved, and forgiven. And I know whom to follow and obey. Today's reading from Matthew, the Great Commandment, undergirds my acceptance of who I am and encourages me to not doubt my abilities and my gifts, for I am here to follow those two powerful commandments. Thank you.
So, a reminder of what we've heard read earlier, Matthew 22, verses 34 to 39. But when the Pharisees heard that they had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbour as yourself."
In 2019, I co-founded a charity to support those sleeping rough on Sydney streets. My mother had a stash of unused wool, and I began looming beanies, and so began hats for homeless. The first year we made 350 beanies, and wow, we thought, that's amazing. Now with 800 Facebook group members, our total in 5 years is 13,500 beanies across Sydney, New South Wales and the ACT, spreading the warmth of beanies, blankets, mittens and scarves, but most of all love to those who are doing it tough or sleeping rough. Love your neighbour as yourself. How? When? And why? At a street kitchen in Wollongong railway station on a freezing July night, I was handing out beanies to a growing queue. The queues have doubled this winter in people looking for meals. I offered a selection of beanies to a frail Aboriginal man. He looked up at my beanie. I'd only made it that morning in Indigenous colours, and he said, "I want that one." Truly, I only hesitated for the amount of time it took to think how much I liked that beanie, and it was going to be my beanie for the winter. Then I took it from my head and I asked him if I could place it on his. "Yes," he said, and then the moment I love my neighbour as myself, he said, "I can feel the warmth of your head on mine. Why? How? Where? It was answered for me then and there, so simply, so profoundly. As well as the commission of Isaiah, as one that steers me to answer the call, I've come to accept the following passage from Micah as my personal mantra, to keep me centred and to not listen to the voices of doubt and imperfections in my calling, to follow, to serve, to love.
From Micah chapter 6, he has showed you, O woman, what is good. And what does your God, the Lord, require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
In Mark, Jesus said that the greatest among us must be the servant of all. Serving others is a way of following Jesus' example and showing his love to the world. It also helps you develop a humble attitude and a generous heart as you put others' needs before your own. Kathy on the left Kathy was on the left. Spent the winter in her wheelchair without any legs outside RPA hospital. And my colleague in Hats for Homeless, Kerry, is here today. We often go out on Thursday nights in a little uniting bus with purple colours, and we find people that we can mostly talk to. We don't like giving out beanies in a box to an organisation. We actually like putting them on people's heads. So that scarf and that hat and those little mittens we gave Kathy that night, and she cried and cried and cried and said, "Thank you for caring for me." She's our pin-up person, Kathy. And this is a man we see every Wednesday night at Woolloomooloo, at the street kitchen there. We usually leave him a warm blanket. We've started knitting blankets called sleeping bag wraps, and they just wrap around you and then you get inside your sleeping bag. So he has one of those, and he has a beanie. Okay. To walk humbly with God is a way of living that reflects God's character and will. It means acknowledging that God is the source of all wisdom, power, and love, and that we depend on him for everything. It also means being grateful for his grace, mercy, and forgiveness, and showing the same to others. For me, walking humbly with God is not something that I could achieve on my own. I need God's grace and help every day to be an advocate, a voice against injustice, to have the confidence to lead a team of 25 chaplains and pastoral practitioners, carers, to conduct funerals, weddings, to be at the bedside of a dying person, and to follow God's calling to a role as a commissioned pastor in the Uniting Church. In response to the Great Commission, the two powerful commandments in Matthew, and in following Micah's call of what is required of me, finally it's not just if there's no one else. So today my prayer for us all, and especially as you gather after for your AGM Part 2. Here I am, Lord. It is I, Lord. I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my hand.